Hi there, hello, welcome back. I apologize for the lighting. I am in my bedroom. Normally, I'm out in my kitchen, but it is really late at night. My parents are asleep, and I don't want to be judged for making this book review. So, I had gotten this book from Tiffany for Christmas. It is Once Upon a Wardrobe by Patty Callahan, and basically, it asks, where did Narnia come from? So, obviously, I'm not the best person to get reviews from, but I did review all of the Narnia books. So, I figured while I had this one, I might as well give it my best shot. So, basically, you have Margaret, who is called Megs throughout the whole entire book, and her little brother George, which for some reason I just kept calling Georgie, but that's probably because Lucy was played by Georgie in the Narnia movies. So that's where my brain went to. But eventually it sorted itself out. So you have George and you have Megs. Those are the two main characters, though their parents are very much important, though you don't see them too much. And then you have C.S. Lewis, his brother Warren, who they call Warnie, and then there's Padrick. Pretty sure I'm saying his name right. For the longest time, I called him Patty and Patrick, which probably is not the best move. He is Irish, so that's fun. So he is another main character that is very important. So basically, starting at the very beginning, we have Megs, who's 17, going to Oxford in 1950. This is the year that Lion Witch and Wardrobe has been published, and her little brother is obsessed. I did have notes originally to try and keep my mind on track, but unfortunately, I stopped taking those notes in like chapter 3, so bear with me. So you have the little brother who has a weak heart, but he is terribly upset. Well, not really upset, but he's very obsessed with Narnia, and rightfully so. It's a very good book. When he finds out that his big sister happens to be at the same place, more or less, where C.S. Lewis is tutoring, he figures, hey, can you go ask him? Can you go ask him where Narnia comes from? It feels so real. It has to be more than just a story. Which, again, if you've ever read it, it does feel like that. So, can't blame the poor kid. She's like, well, I can, but he teaches at part of the school that doesn't really allow ladies. So he still is kind of persistent, be like, hey, can you find out, please? It's one of the only things I want. Keep in mind, he's dying. This 8-year-old boy is dying because of his heart. So eventually, our homegirl just kind of stalks him. She follows him home to his house in the winter, and she just doesn't really build up the courage for 3 days. It's not until his brother, Warren, finds her and is like, hey, you don't seem like a nuisance. Why don't you come in and we'll just warm you up. We'll figure out why you're here, all that fun stuff. And she's kind of amazed that this well-known author, this great man of great works, lives in such a common home. She kind of figured, oh, well, he's rich. He's a great author. He's going to live in this mansion. No, he likes cozy things. He smokes a lot. He has a crap ton of books. Him and his brother just kind of vibe. And she asked him, hey, where does this come from? I need to know. My brother really needs to know before it's too late. But instead of just giving her a straight answer, my guy, my homeboy over here, just starts to give her stories of his life. Starting with when he was just a little boy who was 8 years old, up in his attic, more or less, with his brother coming up with his own little worlds of boxing, and how him and his brother just kind of combined the real world and the world of his fairy tale creatures and talking animals, which was boxing at the time. Then there's another story where he is still very young, and he loves his mother so much. They're on a train ride to this castle, which is Dunlace Castle, I believe, if I remember correctly, and it is in Ireland. That's a very important castle. You'll need to remember it later. So they have this nice trip to this castle, and then we flash forward to where she's sick, which they believe was cancer. They do an operation, and he does everything in his power. He believes, he prays, and his mother dies. Spoiler if you don't know that, but his mother dies. And that is when he pretty much becomes an atheist. He is like, why would a loving God let his mother die? Which hits home for her because her little brother is dying. So I wasn't expecting to get emotional with that part, but I was, considering I lost one of my grandmothers last year in September, and the other grandmother, as of time of recording this, is on hospice. So she has cancer, and his mom had potentially cancer. So the feels were kind of there. It was not a great time in my household. I was very emotional. The grandmother that passed away, I actually have a picture of her in here with me. Oh, I'm knocking over stuff. So that was me and my grandmother. This is the one that passed away last year. This was originally her bedroom, which makes it a little awkward. But we get more stories where he talks about his school life and how he had horrible professors, which one of them I'm borderline convinced was a cult leader. Not gonna lie. And how he just struggled with school. He can never understand math, which, fun fact, she's going to this Oxford University for math and physics. Homegirl is a genius. She believes in logic and logic alone, pretty much. Which is why she's annoyed that he can't give her a straight answer. She goes back to the brother, and the brother is excited to get all of these stories. He's so thrilled. And eventually he gets this little notepad, a sketchbook, and coloring pencils, and he starts to draw. And he's very good at drawing. And he is drawing all of these stories that she's bringing back to him. And every picture somewhere, he has a lion, like Aslan. We're just following along little Jack in his life. Before she goes back for more stories, she runs into her future love interest, which is good old Padrick. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was believed to be dating somebody else. They meet at a pub, they meet on a bridge, and then he just kind of keeps following her around, and he is very much there for stories. He is hopefully eventually a writer. He does eventually become a writer, so spoilers towards the end. The last non-exact chapter, it was like an epilogue. It didn't actually say chapter 25, but it was 25. He becomes an author, and they get married. They have at least one child, and they have 3 grandkids. So her love interest finally shows up. She's like, oh, I'm not like the other girls. I don't wear makeup, and I am plain, and I don't straighten my hair, and I'm just not what guys would want. Which at that point I'm like, girl, why are we doing the I'm not like any other girl trope? But you know, it's fine. They become fast friends, even though she tries to ignore him at one point or 2 points. The rest of the stories that he eventually, C.S. Lewis tells her about the school, is that he gets sent to live with a professor type character who is very much into logic and logic alone, which you can kind of see a little bit of Professor Kirk in the Narnia series, kind of being a little bit like him, but kind of not. That castle that they mentioned earlier is kind of like a ruined version of Paravel. I've always struggled pronouncing that, but you know, the castle in Narnia. Which, if you've read Caspian or any of the others, it makes more sense. But after all of the school years are done, C.S. Lewis is like, well, clearly I can't get into college. I'm bad at math. Well, he gets into college, being bad at math or not, because the First World War starts. So he goes to college, he gets in, he gets stuck in a room that belonged to one of the other guys who did go to war, and eventually he's like, you know what, yeah, sure, I'll go to war. He goes to war, gets sick, gets sent back home, and he's not present for World War II, but his brother has been enlisted in both wars. He basically buries himself in literature. He loves to read, that was his only comfort. Now, I will say that their mother gave them Bibles before she passed away, but obviously that wasn't one of the things that he read. He loved, like, the Odyssey. He loved a book called Fantasies, which he does find in a library, and reads that because she wants to try and gather as much information as she can so she can tell her brother. And well, that was one of the books that he recommended. So he's like, well, maybe I can find something in this book. Maybe I can find something in Fantasies. And that's when he, as in her love interest, shows up again. He's at the library, and eventually they just kind of get into an argument. They get into quite a few arguments, but I'm jumping all over the place. It's kind of hard because it is in first person point of view of her, but then when she's telling the stories to her brother, it switches to a C.S. Lewis third person point of view. But there's sometimes where it's a third person point of view of her little brother. So the POVs are a little bit confusing. It's all over the place. But during the Second World War, he takes in kids, and this is the beginning of his first attempt at writing the Narnia story. He doesn't get very far. The names are different. Peter's the only one that stays true throughout all of it. So he gets the first like paragraph or two done, and then he just shoves it in a desk and leaves it there for 10 years, pretty much, or a little bit longer. But it got the mild inspiration of seeing all of the children that were brought in from London and the war to his home that kind of inspired that, which was something that she would have loved to have told her brother, and she did eventually. Kinda. He didn't really believe her that whenever he started writing it out, that it wasn't immediately Peter, Susan, Lucy, and Edmund, and that it was Peter and 3 other people. It didn't matter. But eventually she goes and meets up with this old Patrick again, and they kind of get into an argument again. She leaves, he follows her. Remember, it's winter, it's before Christmas, so there's a lot of snow in London. They slip on some ice, fall on each other, and eventually he's like, hey, yeah, I like you. They kiss. It kind of breaks her, because she's, again, I'm not like all the other girls. So they kiss. He's like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm not actually dating her. She's nice, but she's not my girlfriend. And she's confused because she's like, oh, okay, cool. And then she goes home, and then there's a little bit more time in between. And all of this time, all George over here wants for Christmas is he wants to go see that castle that had pretty much inspired part of the story of Narnia. So, eventually, they will get to go to that castle, but there's still one last round of stories. And that one is whenever C.S. Lewis meets up with his writing friends, one of those being the author of the Lord of the Rings series. And they're like, oh, well, you know, you can't not prove that God is real. Out of all of your myths, all of your legends, you cannot not prove that this one is the true story because they were Catholic. And eventually, during a scene that we don't actually get to see play out, during the time where they're just walking around at night, C.S. Lewis believes them and eventually becomes saved, which is great. That was a bit emotional too, but not nearly as emotional as later on in the story. That is one of the final stories that he tells her to tell her brother. The final one is where we pretty much get where you had Mr. Tolkien and you had C.S. Lewis, and they're like, well, if we want a children's story that's not trash, we have to write it ourselves. And that's what they do. They write their own children's story. One of them, obviously, was Narnia, which he picks up the paper that he had started before, and the idea of the 4 children, that's still solid. He just changes the names, and he just doesn't stop writing until it's complete. And it was 2 years before present time in the book that he started this again. So obviously it gets published. Obviously he's working on even more stories. Unfortunately, George does not get to live to see Caspian being published or any of the other books. Christmas Eve rolls around, and she has tried her best to connect all of these dots to say that, oh, well, Lucy was the grand godchild, and then Peter was after one of his friends, and Aslan could be after the lion in one of his favorite books. It doesn't work. He doesn't believe it. It's a silly thing that she tried. That was one of the things that Patrick made fun of her a little bit. But, it's fine. They end up going on this trip together. Patrick, Megs, and George all hop into his dad's car and travel from where they live to a ferry to get to Ireland to go see the castle. Keep in mind, this homeboy is getting sicker and sicker. He was just at the hospital for oxygen not too long ago because they thought he was gonna die. There he goes. They have a grand old time at the castle. They come home on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. He gets to spend with his family. And then before New Year's, 1951, the kid dies. They have a funeral. C.S. Lewis, Morny are all there, so is Patrick. They are now officially thanking him and Megs. And I was not prepared. I knew going into it that the poor child was probably going to die. But I have blind hope and blind faith that, he would have survived. But no, the kid died. He dies. And my mom is blasting music as I'm trying to read this chapter of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you've been so, so good. And I'm just thinking, the timing? Why are you thinking that this poor kid is dead? They're at the funeral, and that was the other time that got me emotional. Because I knew that he was more than likely going to die, and then he did die. And then we get the flash forward to where she's written the book about basically everything that she had, all the stories, telling the brother, and now all of the pictures that the brother had drawn throughout this whole time, she used as illustrations in the book, and she's telling her grandson named George all of the story, and it was just from start to finish an emotional roller coaster that I wasn't fully expecting, probably because in my life I do have one grandmother that passed, one grandmother that's sick, and I don't know what's happening. And then my mother blasting that music when I was trying to read in the quiet of my bedroom. I was reading in here most of the day to finish this book. Overall, out of 5 stars, I'd give it 4.5. Probably could have been 5 out of 5, but I didn't like the swapping of the POVs. The first person, third person. I would have preferred it just be one solid, but that could just be how she likes to write. I don't know. There's another book that I want to find of hers, and I will hopefully eventually get it, but for now, that was Once Upon a Wardrobe. And one final note, as she starts to tell the stories every time, they have to start it as talking as once upon a time, not too far away and not too long ago. And that is something that's stuck throughout the whole entire book. Now that for second and third line might have been out of order, but it was always once upon a wardrobe, and that was how she wrote her book. That was what she titles her book in the book. Because her brother had a wardrobe that he found comfort in, because he would always get up, go in there when life was too stressful, and he would just imagine being in Narnia, being surrounded by all of the characters, Aslan, the fawns, the beavers. He would just find comfort And as she's reading them the stories of C.S. Lewis's life, sometimes he's in the wardrobe, sometimes he's in bed. And he's got a grand imagination, and he definitely was so thrilled to finally have pieced together some of the things. Though it wasn't a direct answer, he still got the answers in the end. At one point, she's like, oh, well, is Aslan God? And his response was along the lines that he didn't start out originally wanting Aslan to be God, but at one point in time, it's like, well, this story as what if there was another world that he created and he just showed up in a different form. And that kind of hit home with her. She kind of finally clicks. Because originally she's like, oh, well, is the White Witch maybe Circe from the Odyssey? Is she the Snow Queen from Hans Christian Andersen's book? And he said, oh, well, no, she's a lot of things. Pretty much everything evil in the world. And then she was questioning about, well, is he God? And, well, that was a hard-hitting truth. And honestly, I do recommend you find this. Tiffany got this for me from Ollie's, so I'm sure it's on Amazon. And yeah, I've rambled enough, and I am gonna go now. Goodbye. Wrong button.